Hi there, folks. Welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Today we're going to talk about a momentous decision by the Israeli government to start a military government in Gaza. Although decision is probably not the correct term for this. We're talking more about a drift into a military government. Um, and we'll talk about how and why this is happening. So there hasn't been a public decision to have Israel rule the Gaza Strip, just like there wasn't a public decision on settling, say, the West Bank or anything like that. Very often, when Israel is faced with difficult decisions, it will drift towards a certain policy, um, and that's because there's political arguments over the future of Gaza in Israel, and then there's also international ramifications for any decision. So instead of making a decision, Israel is drifting into military government. But according to several Israeli news sources, and according to people I've talked to as well, there has been a decision to move towards a military government in Gaza without making an official decision. Why is that? Well, the number one reason is something that we've been talking about a lot in this show, which is that you really can't beat Hamas unless you replace it in terms of governance. That's something the army has been saying from day one. And that's something that the government used to push back on, really isn't pushing back on much anymore because the evidence is clear that Hamas keeps rejuvenating if territory is not held. But the reason they're going for a military government instead of moving it towards some sort of Palestinian autonomy or a Palestinian state is because of internal political conflicts over that, in particular, the veto that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have against that sort of idea. But also, there's a lot of resistance in Likud. It's not clear if Netanyahu would want to do that anyway. Another element is since the election of Trump, there's less of a feeling that the United States will try to block anything that Israel does. There's a hope, possibly buttressed by constant conversations between Trump and Netanyahu, that Trump will approve of this, which is certainly quite likely. And then the removal of Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, from his post facilitated this because Gallant, as we'll talk about in this episode, was a very vocal opponent of an Israeli military government in Gaza. So we'll move to talking about some of the decisions the government is making, but a lot of what's been happening in Gaza and the move towards this has been simply the IDF setting itself up for a long stay. Early on in the war, wasn't clear how long the IDF would stay, but now they've begun to, not begun to, they have made many arrangements that will facilitate a long stay, a stay for several years. And officers are saying that they're planning to stay there for several years because they don't see any alternative politically or security wise. So, some of the things that we've seen is the Israeli presence right now in Gaza is in a very limited area, mostly. It's in the Netzarim corridor, which splits northern Gaza from the rest of Gaza. That's become a closed Israeli military base, basically spanning the entire width of the Gaza Strip. It's been expanded from 2 kilometers to 8 kilometers. And considering that all of Gaza is 363 kilometers, that's actually a sizable amount. Then also Israel has taken 1 kilometer from the border on every side to create a security zone. The roads connecting Israeli positions have become very wide and paved from the narrow routes that they started on, and positions, infrastructure for continued IDF hold of the Gaza Strip are already in place, and further construction is underway and is planned in the future. But of course, one of the major problems that Israel faces in its continuing uh, occupation of Gaza is the distribution of food to the population. That works, of course, on two levels. Level one is the constant criticism that Israel receives if it doesn't allow enough aid to the population, which also jeopardizes its relations with the United States and um, gives a higher risk of indictments in the ICC, ICJ, UN resolutions, etc. But also, when aid is allowed in, it's being taken by Hamas. Hamas keeps it for itself in order to supply um, its own troops, takes what's left and distributes it at very high cost to the rest of the population, then takes that money to help rearm itself. So paradoxically, Israel and the IDF are helping Hamas rearm itself. That, of course, in a war is absolutely intolerable. It's amazing that Israel has allowed that to happen up until now. So Israel has been talking a lot about various mechanisms to take over the aid and launching various pilot um, initiatives. Now it's about to launch them. The IDF is about to approve, with the government's backing, a pilot to allow a private company to distribute aid in Gaza. That company is GDC, technically an American company, but it's run by many Israelis and former IDF. The CEO is Moti Kahana, and the board includes several well-known IDF officers like Doron Avital and Yossi Cooperwasser. What the company is planning to do is quite similar to what the US did in certain areas of Afghanistan and in Iraq. They're planning to put up what they call T walls. Those are steel reinforced blast walls um, that have been tried and true in those conflicts. Then there will be entries guarded by the GDC company with biometric recognition systems and individuals placed manning them. The security company will oversee what Kahana told Channel 12 would be a quote, gated community. He also assured the Channel 12 staff that this would not be a ghetto. Now, the area where this pilot will be launched will be one that has been secured already by the IDF. That means most likely Bet Lahia or Jabalia. Certainly, if the pilot succeeds, it will be both. Then it will expand elsewhere. So the idea is, if this pilot works, we don't know if the pilot will work, that the IDF will go into areas, clean out Hamas, hand them over to these private companies, build these walls, and create these quote unquote gated communities. It's not that different from something that the US tried in Vietnam, something called strategic hamlets, and something that the US has done since. And part of what the American goal has always been in wars of insurgency, winning hearts and minds, providing aid to the population, something that Israel has avoided doing until now. Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, has always been an opponent of an Israeli military rule in Gaza. He gave a speech months ago where he said that the fact that Israel is not handing over rule in Gaza to a Palestinian government is dangerous. He said at the time, quote, lack of a decision means making a decision. Creating a military government in Gaza will turn into the main effort of the Israeli government. It will cost in blood and much sacrifice, all to no avail. That was at the time. Now that the news has come out that Israel is trying a pilot with American companies. He is incensed and he just tweeted, quote, talk of a private security company securing the distribution of aid is a sanitized way of starting a military government. The bloody price will be paid by the IDF soldiers and by Israel. Gallant, as well as others like Eisenkot and Gantz, are concerned that this is an irresponsible move that is not one of the war aims. According to some financial estimates, an Israeli government in Gaza, one that will function even minimally, will cost at least $2.5 billion a year. More likely, it will be closer to 5 million and maybe more. That's a significant amount of the current defense budget, which is $24 billion. Benny Gantz said that Israeli soldiers shouldn't be busy taking out the garbage and working with sewage. He called the idea a disaster. But of course, this is going to be farmed out to private companies. And, we've already seen what that would look like in the United States and Afghanistan. Bezalel Smotrich, who is perhaps the most vocal supporter of a direct Israeli military government in Gaza, shot back at Gallant and the other critics. He said Gallant allowed Hamas to take over the humanitarian aid distribution, and that the reason Hamas has been able to rebuild itself is because of Gallant. So, what does this mean? What does it mean that Israel is starting to create a military government in Gaza? It means different things to different people in Israel. One of the reasons this is happening without an agreement is because while there are various people in the IDF and in the government who think this is a good idea, what they can't agree on is what would be the end goal of creating an Israeli military government in Gaza. Some, the more pragmatic, security oriented among the people who support it, look at it as a way of pressuring Hamas into a hostage deal. The idea being if Hamas finally faces a real threat to losing its control over the Gaza Strip, it might change the terms of negotiations. Others look at it as a necessary security arrangement in the long term, as in you can't trust Hamas, you can't trust the Palestinian Authority, so Israel will need to hold this for now. People who believe in that might also agree to transfer authority in Gaza to a Palestinian government that meets certain standards in the future. Then there are those who see this as a path for permanent occupation and building settlements. Smotrich, Ben Gvir, several members of the Likud. We saw that there was a public event calling for resettlement of Gaza, and that would involve a permanent presence in all of Gaza and the resettling of the north. And of course, some people see a connection between the fact that there has been mass evacuation of Palestinian citizens from the north and plans to resettle the north. The drive towards creating a military government in Gaza is at least technically agnostic on what the ultimate goal of that would be, because that would guarantee wider support. But that means that the decisions on how it will go will be created ad hoc, kind of like the way this military government was created ad hoc. And in the West Bank, in the late 60s, 1970s, Israel did the same thing. It ad hoc decided on what it was doing in the area, decided at first not to settle in certain areas, then agreed to settle in certain areas. Over time, there's an accretion of pressure to settle and to deepen the hold. And my fear is that that's what we're going to see in Gaza. Once this starts, we don't know when it will stop. There'll be constant political pressure to deepen, and there will be very little political pressure to release because the right is so much stronger. And even the Israeli left tends to be quite hawkish on these issues. So I'll be following this very closely. This decision hasn't been getting the media attention that it deserves because this is a turning point in the war and it's a turning point in Israel's security policy. Okay, I got a couple of questions for the previous episode, and I will try to answer them as best as I can. So Matthew Levine asks, one of the ideas that has circulated is that, quote, governing infrastructure that replaces Hamas could be derived from and established by Palestinian tribes. The argument is now, it appears, that these tribes would be unable to defend themselves against Hamas. As a result, these groups are unwilling to assert themselves. Could you please comment on this? Yes. So there's been talk about the Palestinian tribes and a tribe solution for a very long time. I think it's very misleading, and I would even say it's pointless. Israel tried to do something similar in the early 1980s in the West Bank, something called the Village Leagues, in order to weaken Fatah and the PLO. At the time, the tribes or clans is a better way of looking at them, were much stronger than they are today. But they completely failed. Their heads were assassinated by the PLO. A lot of them didn't want to cooperate to begin with. Um, Most of Gaza is urban. Clans tend to have more strength in the rural areas and in some of the less densely populated suburbs. And where most people are, the clans don't have any authority to begin with. They've been weakened by urbanization, like in a lot of the rest of the world. In addition, a lot of the clans have no interest in cooperating with Israel. In fact, when Israel was looking at this more seriously, they found two clans that were willing to work with Israel out of several dozen that exist in Gaza. And of course, those heads of those clans were specifically targeted and assassinated. Some of the clans are very close with Hamas. Some of the clans are pro ISIS. Some of the clans are pro Al Qaeda. Um, the idea that you would have a lot of clans willing to cooperate with Israel is fiction. And even if you did, they couldn't control the whole country. If you gave arms to the clans, like some people are suggesting, those would very quickly find their way to Hamas and to other terrorist organizations to kill Israelis. I can't stress this enough. That is a terrible idea. And the only reason Israel even thought about that was out of desperation, and it's already failed. FRDZ4KB asked, statement of fact. The IDF is and has been committing war crimes in Gaza and probably Lebanon. Easy, clear and cut examples uh, exist from the start of the war, and that target Hamas cells in humanitarian zones, killing dozens of civilians. It's abundantly evident that civilian casualties don't matter. The IDF and justice system in Israel are ignoring this completely. What do you think will be the long term impact on Israeli society when they are confronted by what has been done in their name? Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think that there is definitely evidence that Israel has committed some war crimes, mostly by not protecting civilians enough, especially when it comes to some bombings of areas that had dubious military significance in terms of at certain times not allowing in enough aid and so on and so forth. I don't believe any of that reaches the point of genocide or anything like that. I think that any war has war crimes that are committed in. I can't imagine there has ever been one where they weren't committed. As for how Israel is handling this, Israel's not handling this well. There are investigations into certain things. Some of those investigations have been acted upon. Not everything is public, but it's nowhere near enough. And I hope Israel does a lot more. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but also to defend itself against justice in the ICC and the ICJ. Especially the ICC has a complementarity clause that means that if Israel investigates itself, it won't find itself before those forums. But most importantly, to protect civilians. As for how Israel will feel once things are revealed, I don't think that the Israeli public has too many illusions about what's going on in Gaza. They don't like it. They don't like to see it. I'm talking about the average person. Some do like it. There's a right wing group that does like it, but most don't like it and don't want to see it. But they're aware of what's happening. The average Israeli believes that the war is messy and war was necessary after October 7th. I don't think there's going to be much that can be revealed that will change that. There's a left in Israel. A lot of the left supports this war very much. Some of the left doesn't. Some of the left calls it a genocide, war crimes, etc. They're a small minority. I don't think anything that will be revealed, unless there's horrifying things that we don't know, will change that. If there are examples, and I haven't seen any evidence of this, that Israel is lining up civilians and shooting them, and doing the kind of very clear war crimes where you're killing civilians at point blank just in order to kill civilians without any even ostensible military target, that might make a change in Israeli public opinion. But barring that, I don't think that it will. Israel will continue, and Israeli people, regular people, not fanatics, will continue to justify it because October 7th made Israelis feel that steps were necessary. And they believe that if the IDF goes too far, that is a shame, but it's necessary that the IDF fight the war. That's not going to change. TYS asks, we no longer hear about Iran's threats of retaliatory strikes. Has Trump's election made them change their tune? Well, there's no question that Trump has changed a lot of the way that different actors in the region are looking at the future. And that's something that it's really overdue that I should do an episode about. But a lot of that is uncertainty rather than fear, as Trump supporters are trying to paint it. Um, Iran doesn't know what Trump will do. Trump is giving signals that maybe he will negotiate. Trump is giving signals that maybe he will destroy their nuclear program. They're not really sure which way that is going. So, on some level, they would rather not do anything that will um, get Trump annoyed or make him move more towards supporting Israel in a strike against them than right now. So, in that sense, Trump's election has definitely had an influence. Just as important, maybe more important, is the fact that Israel has managed to destroy much of the anti air and other protections that Iran has for their most sensitive targets. The idea that Israel was trying to convey by that was we can hit your oil industry and we can hit your nuclear program without any problems. And that puts Iran in a very bad situation. If they try another attack and it fails, and the last two attacks have failed, I know that there were some things that they hit, but generally they failed. If they launch another attack on Israel and it fails, and Israel launches a massive attack against their oil and their nuclear program, not only will they lose a lot of money and all that, they'll also lose a lot of prestige because Israel is able to do whatever it wants and they're not able to strike back. I have long felt that Iran's tit for tat battle with Israel directly is a losing battle for them. It's much better for them to fight through the proxies. Israel's escalation to a tit for tat has worked very well for Israel. It's not worked well for Iran. That's regardless of Trump. But Trump is adding an element of uncertainty that's making a retaliatory attack by Iran even less appealing. So it's definitely related. Okay, so that's the end of this episode. I'll be watching the military government element closely. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media and consider listening to my History of the Land of Israel podcast. I recently finished an episode about the land of the Kingdom of Israel at its peak. And now I'm working on an episode on the fall of the Kingdom of Israel and its conquest and the exile of its residents. So that's going to be dark and interesting. I'll see you here again next time something interesting happens.